Hi, Rob.
Morning, Eilish. It's Eilish, right?
Eilish is right, yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Go ahead, Rob.
Okay, so good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. This has been a series of events that TASC has been hosting over the past number of months. The theme of today's discussion is how to address the problem of long-term unemployment. This is obviously a very important topic because, you know, this is the second time within a period of, well, just a little over a decade or within a decade that Ireland has been faced with a huge unemployment crisis. In fact, this unemployment crisis is going to be even more severe than the last crisis due to the financial and banking crisis that began in 2008. Now, hopefully, we won't have to endure the long pain and suffering that we did last time around. And some of the speakers are going to talk about some of the challenges. And so I'll just get along to the introductions. You know, my name is Robert Sweeney. I'm the Senior Policy Analyst at TASC, and I'll be moderating this event. So you can use the chat area to ask any questions. So I'll just going to introduce each of the panelists, and then they will speak for a period. One of our panelists, Eilish Kelly of the SRI, will make a presentation, and Tricia and Breed will make a shorter contribution. And the idea is to have a discussion among the panelists, and then we'll open it up to audience Q&A. But we're hoping to have a kind of an interactive conversation. It's not a formal academic panel session. So in alphabetical order, our first speaker is Eilish Kelly. Eilish Kelly joined the ESRI as a postdoctoral fellow in September 2006, and she is currently a senior research officer in Economic Analysis Division. She has bachelor and doctorate degrees in economics from Trinity. Her main research interest is labor economics, with a particular focus on unemployment and market programs, migration, wages, and pay bargaining institutions. So nobody is better placed to speak on the issue of unemployment and labor market issues in Ireland. So Eilish, if I could hand it over to you, and if you want to share a screen for your presentation, that'd be great.
Okay, thanks, Rob. So just bear with me while I share the screen. So hopefully that's visible to everybody.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Okay, so good morning, everyone, and thanks for attending this morning, and thanks also to Rob and his colleagues for the opportunity to participate in this discussion on long-term unemployment. So basically what I would just like to do briefly, I suppose, maybe to provide some context to the discussion, is to maybe just look at what impact COVID-19 has had on unemployment, first of all, then maybe look at, you know, what are the characteristics of those that are long-term unemployed pre and during the pandemic. Also then maybe just to discuss some issues around trying to examine long-term unemployment with the official data, just in terms of the official measures that's used, and maybe then just to look at maybe a different angle on potential individuals who may become long-term unemployed as a result of COVID-19. So just to start with then, just looking at the impact of COVID-19 on unemployment. So most of you will probably be aware or have seen this. So this is the CSO's monthly unemployment estimates of since the start of COVID up until now. So what the CSO did when COVID hit is they produced a COVID-19 adjusted measure of unemployment, and they also continued to produce their traditional estimate of unemployment based on the ILO, the International Labour Organization's definition. So I suppose, first of all, looking at the traditional measure, you can see that just at the start of COVID, we had an unemployment rate of 4.8% in March. And that has fluctuated a little bit, I suppose, over the pandemic. But I suppose what we're seeing in the last couple of months, it's minor, but it has gone obviously from 4.8% up to 8% as of May of this year. In terms of the COVID-19 adjusted rate then, which takes account of the people who would be on the pandemic unemployment or the employment support scheme that was set up by Revenue. Again, what you can see there, obviously, that unemployment rate peaked at 31.5% in April of last year. It then fell, I suppose, as the economy opened, but obviously then as the number, the variants and the number of cases increased towards the end of last year in January, it went back up to 27%, and it would appear to be on a downward trajectory again. I suppose the only caveat there would be the most recent Delta variant of the virus. So I suppose it'll be just interesting to see what happens over the next few months. But I suppose that one of the key points there is still that the traditional rate has, even aside from the COVID-19 adjusted measure, there has been a gradual increase in the traditional measure of unemployment. This is a similar chart, except it's just based on the labour force survey data, and again it's showing quarterly unemployment, but also what's been happening with the long-term unemployment rate. So again, I suppose just before the start of the pandemic, our long-term unemployment rate was probably down at about just less than 2% of that, and it even went to a low of 1.1% in quarter 2 of 2020. And it is gradually rising, but I suppose it's gradually rising from a very low base. But I suppose it is something to watch and observe over the next few months to see what happens to that rate. And the regular unemployment rate is showing a similar picture to the previous chart, that it's gone from 5.4% in quarter 4 2018 up to 7.1% today. So as I said, the traditional rate is showing a gradual increase of that as well. Just then to maybe look at some of the profile of people who are long-term unemployed. So this again is based on the labour force survey data, and it's the ILO measure of unemployment. So what I've done here is I've looked at what are the characteristics of those that were classified as long-term unemployed before the pandemic and during it, which was quarter 4 2020, so just towards the end of last year. So I suppose that the first point to note there is that, in general, more males tend to be long-term unemployed than females. And over the pandemic, that appears to have increased. It's gone from 59.3% up to 63.4%. In terms of the age profile, then, what I suppose the two main groups that we're seeing an increase in over the pandemic period will be those aged 25-34, where it's gone from 18.2% of those that were long-term unemployed being in this age bracket up to 25.2%. And also those aged 55 to 64. So again, you're seeing an increase there from about 16% to just over 19%. In terms of educational profiles then of those that are long-term unemployed, so again, the two main categories there that you're seeing an increase in will be those with an upper secondary qualification, which would be your Leaving Cert qualification, and also those with a third level honours degree. So the secondary has gone from 23% up to 30%, and those with the third level in terms of the profile that are long-term unemployed, it's gone from 16.3 up to about 21%. So increases it will be in those two main educational categories. Looking then at the duration of long-term unemployment, I suppose that the big jump there will be for those who have been more than 2 years unemployed up to 47 months. So that's gone from 24.2% pre-COVID up to 30.3% during the middle of the pandemic. So there appears to be an increase in that particular duration category for those that are long-term unemployed. So I suppose one of the things about the official statistics is that, which is the ILO measure, it hasn't been adjusted to account for those who have lost their jobs because of the pandemic. But in the labour force survey data, you have an additional measure of unemployment that's captured to the principal economic status question, which is a subjective measure of people's own assessment of what their economic status is. So what this table here is presenting is those people on the PUP payments, how they classify themselves, and also how they're classified by the ILO, and it also shows it for all persons. But I suppose focus specifically on those in the PUP payments, almost double the number of individuals would classify themselves as being unemployed compared to how they will be ILO measured as being unemployed. And I suppose that really highlights, I suppose, the issues with the official measures of unemployment and long-term unemployment, is that they're not adjusted to count for people who have lost their jobs because of COVID-19. So that's, I suppose, something to bear in mind when we're looking at the figures and the characteristics that there's possibly an undercount there because of the fact that those official measures don't take into consideration people who have lost their jobs because of COVID-19 and who may, as a result, become an official job seeker, as is captured by the ILO measure. So just then to look briefly at the profile of those who classify themselves as being principally economic status unemployed. So I suppose again here what I've done is I've looked at pre and post, or pre and during COVID-19, I should say. So here I suppose what we're capturing with the principal economic status measure of unemployment is that there's been an increase in the percentage of females who are PES unemployed over that time period. So it's gone from 41.4% to just almost 49%. In terms of the age profile, then it's predominantly those aged 55 to 64 where you're seeing an increase. So it's gone from just 13.4 up to about 17%. In terms of educational attainment, then you're seeing a similar picture to what the ILO measure would have showed you for those who are long-term unemployed. So again, it's those with an upper secondary qualification and those at a third level honours degree or above where you're seeing the growth in the numbers that are unemployed. And this is probably reflective of the sectors that have been affected, particularly for the upper secondary. So then I suppose just finally, just to wrap up in terms of this particular part of the discussion, just in terms of some of the, I suppose, the work by the Department of Social Protection, obviously they're the main body that are looking after activation services for those that are unemployed. And they also look after the pandemic unemployment payment. So I suppose we'll all concede that the numbers in receipt of the PUP is falling, even though it is slowly. And I suppose the one caveat there is just what impact this Delta variant of the virus is going to have further reopening on the economy, and therefore the numbers who are in receipt of the PUP, and also then as a knock-on effect, the numbers that will be unemployed and potentially long-term unemployed. In terms of the DSP, they have started to engage with about 10,000 PUP claimants on a weekly basis. This started a few weeks ago, and they started with those that had been in longest receipt of the payment. So in some ways, I suppose, by doing that, they might potentially be able to assist in keeping the numbers that are long-term unemployed or go into long-term unemployment down. And the other component is that the DSP have also resumed their activation engagement for the general job seekers as well. So the two of them may potentially help keep the numbers that are entering long-term unemployment down. So as I said, that was just to set the context, I suppose, for this morning's discussion. So I'll hand it back to you, Rob. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Eilish. Plenty of food for thought there, and I personally have plenty of questions I'd like to ask, but we'll get to the questions afterwards, and we'll move on to our next speaker. So the next speaker is Tricia Keelty. She is Head of Social Justice and Policy at Society of St. Vincent de Paul. She works closely with the SVP to identify social justice issues emerging through the experience of St. Vincent de Paul members. And she has over 12 years experience of applied social research and has worked for a variety of organizations such as Combat Poverty, One Family, the Institute of Public Health in Ireland, and as well as a variety of research roles with Trinity and UCD. She has a PhD in social policy from UCD and a master's in applied social research from Trinity. And so Tricia, over to you.
Thanks very much, Rob, and good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, should I say. Thanks very much to Eilish for setting the scene. I'd just like to talk specifically about kind of the core issues that come up for SVP in our working communities related to long-term unemployment, both prior to COVID and the impact that the pandemic has had on people that we're assisting as well. So I suppose we provide direct assistance to people experiencing poverty and marginalisation, and that tends to be people who may be outside the labour market and have caring responsibilities, particularly lone parents, those with disabilities, single adults who maybe have experienced intergenerational disadvantage, and also migrants. We'd also support people who are underemployed and working in low-paid jobs and maybe experiencing in-work poverty as well. So I suppose I just want to focus specifically maybe just in the kind of opening remarks in relation to lone parents, because about 70% of the calls that we receive are from households with children, and the majority of those are headed by a lone parent. And we know that the poverty rates, particularly among lone parents, are very high. Compared to other European countries, lone parents have the second highest rate of income poverty, persistent poverty and severe deprivation. And that is also related to the very low levels of employment among lone parents. We know the employment rate of lone parents is the lowest among EU 15 countries, just at 58%. But we also know that employment rates increase with the age of their child. So for example, the rate increases to 66% among parents with children over the age of 12. So once those childcare demands reduce, employment increases, and that also links to the very high cost of childcare for lone parents. We know that 60% of lone parents said they couldn't access childcare services for financial reasons. I suppose in terms of government policy, there has been recent focus on the activation of lone parents. We know that the wide-ranging reforms were introduced from 2012 onwards, aimed at increasing the employment of lone parents. And I suppose that those changes have led to a lot of criticism, particularly because they removed a lot of the features of the one-parent family payment that supported part-time work, which is often the only option for lone parents if they don't have access to childcare. And while we did see from 2012 onwards an increase in the number of lone parents in work, we also saw an increase in in-work poverty as well, from 9% in 2012 up to about 20% in 2019. And we know that lone parents are more likely to be in this work, more likely to be in temporary contracts, and also more likely to be in low paid work. So in terms of the situation prior to COVID, we were seeing more parents that were in work, but that work tends to be low paid. And then COVID has also had a disproportionate impact on the employment status of lone parents, and also the impact of lone parents who are outside the labour market, who are trying to survive on inadequate social welfare payments as well. So just to pick up on some of the points Eilish raised in relation to data, not all lone parents will be captured in the definition that we use for long-term unemployment, and we also don't have good data on the impact of COVID on the labour market attachment of lone parents, because family type isn't captured in some of the unemployment rates, adjusted unemployment rates for COVID-19. But we do know that lone parents in research by the SRI are particularly more likely to be employed in part-time or precarious jobs, and were less likely to be able to work from home. And a relatively high number of essential employees providing frontline services in food, retail, health and social care services had caring responsibilities, and lone parents were disproportionately affected by the lack of childcare, particularly its availability in the first wave, and the difficulties lone parents had in maintaining their attachments to the labour market. And so we are concerned that there has been an increase in employment among lone parents during this time. And we also know that they were more dependent on relatives to provide childcare, but that wasn't obviously an option in terms of fear around the virus and older relatives taking care of children during that time. So we know that lone parents probably have been disproportionately impacted by job losses, but we don't really have good data on that at the moment. I suppose in terms of the response from the Department of Social Protection, they did retain the supports, in-work supports for people in receipt of the one-parent family payment and the working family payment. So that mitigated some of the worst impacts for families in terms of keeping incomes, and that they could also retain the pandemic unemployment payment as well. But for many lone parents and people who are reliant on the inadequate social welfare payment of 203, things like food and energy poverty were exacerbated as households were faced with higher costs during lockdowns, and many went into debt and had no savings to fall back on as well. So we're going to see an exacerbation of poverty and deprivation as well, it seems, in terms of the impact that we're seeing in communities. And I suppose just overall, we have significant concerns around the poverty and job losses among this group, but there's been very little discussion in government recovery plans on the specific needs of lone parents. And I suppose just in terms of some of the solutions that we see going forward, we know that in countries with lower rates of poverty and higher rates of employment among lone parents have subsidised affordable care, adequate pay floors, flexible working arrangements for parents, and also effective systems of child maintenance. So if we're thinking about the recovery, we need to look at those key 4 pillars in terms of supporting lone parents who maybe need to access social welfare or access employment post-COVID. I suppose there's also in terms of some of the issues related to how we support activation measures for lone parents and adopting an education first approach rather than a work first approach in terms of the very high levels of in-work poverty experienced by lone parents and the need for integrated wraparound services for families as well. And then I think it's also a good discussion around the value placed on caring work and the care economy and the need to support part-time work as well. And I think some of the recommendations from the Citizens Assembly on gender equality are pretty pertinent in that regard as well. And then obviously the pandemic has really shown, I think for the most part, how important adequate income supports are for people that support a life with dignity and also allow people to access opportunities. And I suppose we need to ensure that income supports are adequate if we are going to see a period of unemployment for the next couple of months in terms of the recovery as well. So I think that's just some of the key observations from SVP, and I'll leave it there for the moment. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Tricia. Lots of things to think about there, especially with lone parents. I'll move on now to our third speaker, and that is Robert OBrien. Breed is the INOU's head of policy and media. The INOU is the Irish National Organisation for Unemployed, and she plays a key role in formulating and developing INOU policy on unemployment, social welfare, and the development of an equitable labour market. On behalf of the INOU, Breed works with colleagues in the community and voluntary sector on issues of socioeconomic justice, and she is one of the community and voluntary pillar representatives on the National Economic and Social Council. So Breed has a lot of experience in dealing with unemployment and people suffering from long-term unemployment, and so I'm very keen to get her comments and thoughts today.
Okay. Thanks very much, Robert, and good morning, everybody. The theme of today's seminar is addressing the problem of long-term unemployment. Eilish gave a very interesting presentation on the figures, and I just thought some of what she's pulled out in terms of the impact on the age cohorts and particularly the educational attainment, I thought was very interesting. Because when you look at employment rates vis-a-vis educational status, normally as the educational status goes up, the unemployment rates come down for people. Now, we know, and work that the SRI have done, around just people maybe having gone back to education and training, that in some initiatives, the outcomes that we would all hope for don't seem to materialize. And again, I just think it'll be interesting just to have to explore all of these issues further, because often education is seen, and it is seen, as a critical link between the labour market and the person, and in particularly a good job. And a good job is what all of us want to see people who are out of work get. So I think that's one of the challenges that we need to understand. Why is it that in some cases when people do go back to reskill and educate, why are they not getting the employment outcomes that you would expect? Are there issues of stigma in our labour market that need to be addressed? Do employers assume because somebody may be returned to education that they're not then that interested in employment? Is it that the person went and did an education or training course that the employer doesn't fully understand? It's not one of the traditional ones. And for all they give out about the leaving cert into this and to that, often it seems to be that people go with what they know rather than maybe alternative education training routes that might actually be providing the person with the more specific skills for that job. So I think that's one of the challenges that we need to address as we go forward. Where are the opportunities for people? What skills do they have? What skills do the jobs that are available to them require? In particular, what skills and experience are the good jobs that they could access with the right supports? And do we have an employment service that's providing those supports? We will be concerned that increasingly the service is described as an activation service, when really what we need, particularly in a changing world of work, is an employment service that is available to everybody of working age, regardless of whether or not they're in receipt of a welfare payment, for people who are in low paid work, people who would like to change their jobs, people who are in jobs that if all the forecasts are correct, will not be there in the future. And if some of the climate change measures that we are expected as a people to undertake, we do undertake, some of those jobs will go as well. So how do we address those issues and ensure that people can access a decent job? One of the issues that also that's there with the official figures is that to be captured as unemployed, somebody has to answer yes to two questions. You have to be actively seeking work in the past 4 weeks. You have to be available to take up work in the next 2 weeks. Now, you may, if you've had no joy getting a job, if an employer has, none of the employers you've applied to respond to you, and this is something people experience, you get to a point where you stop looking because there's only so much of hitting your head off a stone wall anybody can take. So that is so often then we would feel that the official figures are undercounting long-term unemployment because of that reason. And then likewise, the availability. For many of the reasons that Tricia identified, people might feel, oh yeah, I'd love to get a job. That'd be great. But if I did get one, I'd have to sort out childcare or transport could be a big issue. And that can be a big issue depending on where in the country people live. So there are very practical issues there that need to be borne in mind so that we are not necessarily capturing everybody who's long-term unemployed. And in the services and programs that are there for people who are long-term unemployed, they may not be capturing them either. Just to do people's head in even more on the stats front, there's a very interesting figure that the CSO produce when they produce the labour force survey. It's called the potential labour supply. So it captures people who don't answer yes to one or other of those questions. It also captures the underemployed. And what's very interesting is before this crisis hit, in the first quarter of 2020, when we were facing into a general election, when everybody was talking about full employment, that figure stood, the potential labour supply figure stood at 16.8%. In the most recent figure for the first quarter this year, it was at 22.9%. So for us, that really captures the demand that is there for work, all other things being equal. And so we really do need to ensure that the services that we have, the supports that we have, are capturing those people so that people really feel there are services and supports there for them that will help them to secure a decent job. And in the meantime, for those who are on a welfare payment, and picking up on Tricia's point, at our most recent annual delegate conference, our general branch, that is the mechanism through which people are unemployed, play an active part in the running of the organisation. They put a motion to conference basically saying that as the government had acknowledged the inadequacies of existing payments to the rollout of the pandemic unemployment payment, that existing payments have to be increased. So that is an issue that we must address, because one of the challenges that faces people who are long-term unemployment, people who are long-term on a welfare payment, is that it is extremely difficult to survive on it. The poverty rates clearly identify this. And so the issue of income adequacy, we must also address while we are supporting people to be able to secure a decent, well-paid job and secure their own economic independence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Breed. Some good discussion there of the links between education and employment, or perhaps that link is not as actually strong as what some people might believe. So something to think about for the audience, in particular when they're posing some questions. So our fourth and final speaker is Anthony O'Connor. We're delighted that he's joining us from Manchester today, online of course. Anthony is Director of Fundraising and Development at Manchester Cathedral. Manchester Cathedral, among other things, works with unemployed people in bringing them back to the labour market. Previous to joining in 2008, he worked with Sheffield Cathedral and also the Department of Work and Pensions. So he has quite a diverse background, and I'm keen to hear what he has to say today. So over to you, Anthony.
Good morning, everybody. Hopefully you can all hear me quite well. I can't really see many faces, but anyway, I trust you're all there. And thank you, Robert, for the introduction. First of all, it's nice to actually be on a conference call with all my distant cousins in Ireland. I mean, my mum and dad came over from Ireland to England in the late 1950s, 60s. And so I've got, obviously, with a name like Anthony O'Connor, quite an Irish connection. So most of my family actually come from the country, down the country. So that was just an interesting phrase I heard, where my dad comes from Traleen, County Kerry, and my mother comes from Tipperary. So anyway, it's very interesting, actually. First of all, they just made some notes and observations. So some of the terminology that you use in Ireland is quite different to the terminology that we use over here. And I think leaving certs and stuff like that in education, it's just slightly different. Something we're all speaking English, but we're divided by a common language. Just to kind of give you a bit of my background, primarily I joined the civil service when I was 23 in London, and it's funny how a journey starts in life. But I basically did just under 20 years working for the civil service, and I went on loan from the civil service to the Church of England, which is where I am now, under Davidlunkett, who was then Secretary of State for the Department for Work and Pensions. I met my partner and I moved from London to Manchester probably nearly 30 years ago now. It's getting on, and we've kind of settled up here, and I've settled in the northwest, and it's a great area, Manchester, and has a population of just under 3 million people. I took up my role at Manchester Cathedral in 2008. I came here having delivered a successful fundraising campaign at Sheffield Cathedral, where I was on secondment for 4 years, and then I left the civil service and I went working for the Church of England full time, you know, and you know, I didn't know the institution of the Church of England too well. I know it very well now after spending nearly 20 years in it, but I'm trying slowly to bring them back into the fold. But anyway, hey ho. When I came to Manchester, primarily my major aim here was to actually raise capital funding, which I have done. But what I did do, having spent so many years in DWP, was that I started a volunteer program, and it started very organically, and it was about the cathedral playing a role in society or in the communities that we serve that could help the long-term unemployed. So my charity now, which I'm basically like the de facto chief executive of, we engage with around about 120 prior to COVID, about 120 long-term unemployed a year. Now, Greater Manchester is a population of just under 3 million. So we touched the tip of the iceberg. But in my 20 years experience working for the Church of for the civil service and now within the Church of England, it's given me a great insight into the human character. And when I started this program, it was all really built on volunteering. And the reason for that is that I find unemployment probably one of the biggest social stigmas that affects us. And the politicians treat it a bit like a hot potato. You know, they'll look at unemployment when it's rising and they'll pick it up and handle it. And then when it gets okay, they'll drop it again and then they'll pick it up. And that's okay when you have times of recession and the country's trying to rebuild. But when you've got times like even over here, even with COVID, the unemployment rate here now is still pretty low. I mean, like we're about 4% unemployment, and there's parts of Greater Manchester now where there's vacancies on the door and they can't get people to fill them. You know, a third of the restaurants in Greater Manchester at the moment cannot open because not the fact that they can't open, the fact is they can't recruit the staff. We do not have the people. I don't know whether Brexit's part of that. But for me, when I started this program, was always about volunteering and giving people some practical experience that could be transferred into the labour market. And when I was looking at your statistics, what was really interesting in that first presentation, I'm sorry I was a bit late. I was with the dean and sometimes the clergy, so you've got to kind of go when they call you. But what was interesting about that first presentation was that some of the real low levels of academic education and all that, them rates they're pretty stagnant. And what you've got here within Greater Manchester is that we still have great areas of urban deprivation where single parents, lone parents, all different type of people with low educational achievement in their life are either on the first or the couple rungs of a ladder into employment. And applying for jobs and they've never really had an awful lot of that. So a lot of these people get in and out of low or semi-skilled work on a regular basis. And then when they're out of work, a lot of people like single parents can get into a rut. And while we've got a very healthy benefit system over here, probably similar, I think the Irish is probably slightly better than ours. But one of the things our benefit system does do, it does actually get people into a rut. So apart from being long-term unemployed and not really having many friends or that social isolation, what it also leads to is debt, and it leads people into a rut and into a way of life that is probably very unhealthy. So when I started this program, I started to actually get the job centre, and I work with all the job centres across Greater Manchester where they refer people onto this program. And it's initially for 10 weeks, but people have to engage in at least a half a day a week volunteering. And through that, we try and pick them up, develop their self-esteem, develop their confidence and their value in themselves as a human being. And I wanted to actually share 2 human stories with you today to show what I would feel is the impact of unemployment on really a segment of our society, and you probably have that in Ireland, of people who, for one reason or another, didn't have a great mum and dad to bring them up and didn't look after their education, and had things happen to them in their life that they've ended up being just on the periphery of everything that we do. And I had a single parent that joined this program a few years ago now. She came on, and she came, and you probably have this in Ireland as well. You know, she was a young woman, vibrant. that lived in a relationship with a chap who didn't really appreciate her as a woman. She had 3 children, and when she went to the job centre said, well, the youngest is getting quite old now, I think you just need to start to look for work, was referred to this programme. And I had her on this programme for 18 months. And it took a while, actually. And I remember her saying to me one day, she said, Anthony, do you know what she said? She said, when you've been told you're a nothing and you're a nobody and you're rubbish for years and years and years, she said, you actually start to believe it. And what I tried to do on this program, what I did do with her, was to basically build her up and make her feel valued as a woman. And to cut a long story short, she ditched that fella and we married her here. She got to a new chap a few years later and got married. But we did, in the end, get her a job. And her journey, once she got a job, it was a part-time job, but once she did get a job, she was then promoted within that, and she became full-time. After about 3 years with this restaurant in Manchester that we got her in, she got the job as the general manager. And that was an incredible journey for her and how she actually came into herself. And another story of a chap that we had came on this program, and when he left school at 16 or 17 in Ireland, and he left school with really not very much academic attainment, if anything really, his mum and dad decided that they would confine him to his bedroom, and the only time he was out of the house was when he went to the job centre every week to sign on. And when he was at home, the only time he came downstairs was to pick up his meals, and he took his meals up to his own bedroom. And after 13, 14 years being confined to his bedroom, he actually lost the ability to talk and to speak. And the system gave up on him. But one charity in Manchester referred him to this programme. And again, he was on this programme here for well over a year, probably close to about a year and a half. And in the end, we did move him into work and he did get a job. So I look at what I've done here with Volition, and any of you can call it up and have a look at it and see the stuff that we do. But I look at volunteering as an incredible way of organisations, and the church is an absolutely fantastic organisation to do it, and other organisations, or galleries, libraries, museums, is to actually engage with the long-term unemployed, offer them opportunities where you can start to move them and get them to feel good about themselves. And the one great thing with Manchester Cathedral is that I do use this institution with a lot of companies and organisations in Greater Manchester to give people work trials and mock interviews and all that type of stuff. Because today, I don't know what it's like in Ireland, but if a company today advertises for a semi-skilled or low-skilled job, you can get 500 to 600 applications here across the board. Now, with every will in the world, there is no company that's going to sift through 500 applications. So the vast majority of people, going back to what one of your other colleagues said, is that when people are applying and they're not getting any responses to anything, how does that affect people's mental health? How does that affect their self-esteem and the value that they place in themselves? Because they're saying to themselves, well, I'm doing everything right, but nobody's taking any interest in me. And I suppose really for me, having a very Catholic upbringing with a good Catholic home, for me, it's always about the value of every human being and the value of human life. And while statistics are great, I get all that stuff. I see, I go through that stuff all the time. For me, it was about addressing the needs of some of the lowest people in our society who have very low self-esteem, low education, low confidence, and how we can help move them forward and get them into a job. And just one final story, and then I'll shut up, and I'm open then to if anybody wants to come back to me. I had a young chap that came onto this program probably around about 5 or 6 years ago now, and he was just like a young lad, He was in his early 20s. He just didn't, nobody really sat him down and gave him any guidance. And I hosted a concert here at Manchester Cathedral. I had Alicia Keys came here to perform with MTV Crashes Manchester. And I spoke to the production company, the AV company who did it, the production. And after a bit of a tug of war, they took him on and they gave him a 4-day work trial as part of the deal of being the production people here. And after that, they offered him a job. They loved him. They took him in, and all this young lad needed was somebody to actually value him as a person and take him on board. And that's what I tried to do, really. And prior to COVID, this young lad was flying around the world, doing events all over the world. So my program I'm very proud of. I've taken over 1,100 people now through the program. I move close to 40 to 50% year on year into work. My annual report for the last 3 years is on the website. You can have a look at it and gives you a nice flavour of what I do over this side of the Irish Sea. But it's lovely to be part of this today, and I'm very grateful for Rob and colleagues for inviting me. But hopefully that's been a nice little oversight.
Thank you very much, Anthony. That was a very engaging contribution. It's great to get the personal stories on top of the statistics, and obviously you're doing some great work in Manchester. We do just have one comment. I don't know if you can see it, from Rob Carey, and he says, "Welcome from Tralee, Anthony." So we've got someone from Tralee, and I mean, I have plenty of things that I want to ask the panelists on their contributions, and I'm sure the panelists have things they want to ask the other panelists. And so I'll plow ahead with some of my questions, but audience members, do feel free to ask questions as the discussion ensues. So first of all, I'll just ask Eilish, partly a clarification. So it seems that unemployment, like men have been slightly more hardly hit than women from an unemployment perspective. Am I correct in saying that first, when we're talking about the pandemic at least? And why is that the case? Because I would have thought that women are more prevalent in occupations such as hospitality, entertainment, and so on. So yeah, I'll just start with that then.
Okay, all right, thanks. So I suppose, yes, the when you look at the official, as I said, so one of the issues in Breed mentioned as well, and Tricia, is that the official measures don't necessarily capture everyone that's been affected by COVID. So I suppose the analysis that I did kind of showed that, interestingly. So when you look at the characteristics of the long-term unemployed using the official ILO measure, you're seeing that unemployment, there has been an increase, a bigger increase among men than women, but has been over that time period. So it would appear, right, Rob, that there's a larger portion of men have been affected by COVID compared to women. In general, you tend to get more men that have been unemployed and long-term unemployed compared to females. But just in terms of your question in COVID, that's what the official measure is showing. But I suppose what was interesting is when you looked at the principal economic status measure of unemployment, which is people's own subjective measure, you're actually seeing that the increase has been bigger among women. So I think that really highlights the issue, or it's one of the ways of highlighting the issue with the official measure versus a more subjective measure, that the official measures at the moment are not necessarily fully capturing the impact of COVID-19 on the labour market and who is being affected. And I think Tricia really highlighted that in her presentation when you spoke about the lone parents and that as well.
Okay. Yeah, because I was a little bit unsure. Yeah, and that's what I thought. The more subjective measure shows that women are more adversely impacted. If I have a question for Tricia. So you mentioned Ireland has among the highest poverty rates for lone parents in the European Union. Now, there's two ways you can look at that. So how would you address that, Tricia? Because there's two ways you can address that. One from a progressive perspective, shall we say, and another from a not so progressive perspective, that i.e. we need to increase financial incentives to work, and which can be sometimes code for, well, let's cut some of our welfare entitlements. So first of all, is it desirable, in your opinion, to increase employment among lone parents? And how would you address poverty among lone parents, Tricia?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. It's a good question, and I think in terms of how we address poverty among lone parents, I think it's very clear. Firstly, of course, increasing employment is beneficial, but it has to be good quality employment, and that needs to be supported by good quality services, particularly childcare. I'm sorry. No, am I still there? Yeah. Okay, yeah, sorry, I might just switch off my video. I think my connection is unstable. Sorry, yeah. So just in terms of the supports that are needed to ensure lone parents access good quality work that recognises the additional challenges for people who are parenting alone and who have to balance both being the primary earner and the primary caregiver for their family. So I think firstly, as I mentioned, we need to take an education first approach, particularly for those who are most distant from the labour market. We know some lone parents have low levels of educational attainment, and we don't want to see a situation where people aren't in work that provides a decent level of income for their families. So I think there's a couple of things that we could do. Firstly is in relation to the SUSI grant. At the moment, it's not available to people who are studying part-time, which may be a good option for people who have caring responsibilities. Secondly, some of the training options which are there don't provide adequate support for childcare and transport costs. So there's ways in which that we can promote access to further education and training that support those extra costs for parents as well. I think also in terms of what you see in other European countries is having an adequate wage floor that's protected and supported by a comprehensive system of social protection, so that we've got good in-work supports for parents, and also that parents can access good quality childcare that's free ultimately. And I think there's huge potential with the EU Child Guarantee, which has been recently adopted by the European Council, which would guarantee children from disadvantaged circumstances access to free early years care and education, and in terms of supporting children in lone parent families to access that, because that's kind of the fundamental issue in terms of barriers to employment. And I think when you look as well at the income supports for people who are outside of the labour market, we need to ensure that they're adequate, because we know from the Vincentian Partnership for Social Justice, their research, which looks at the minimum essential needs of different household types in Ireland, that households headed by a single adult, namely lone parents and single adults, have the deepest levels of income inadequacy. So we need to ensure that people are supported and that they have adequate incomes to meet their living costs, because we know the cost of living is so high here in Ireland. And we need to ensure our social protection system provides that safety net for people and provides the basis for people to access their opportunities as well. And that's really important.
Right, so it's, I guess, a range of supports, education, wage floors, and so on. Now, Breed, you mentioned education quite a bit in your contribution, and you mentioned that having an education isn't necessarily now a guarantee of getting a job. Ireland does have, and maybe, I know that people with degrees are not necessarily the most represented in the long-term unemployed, but Ireland does have a very highly educated population, at least when you look at the proportion of the population which has a third level qualification. Now, for me, there's value in an education in and of itself, independent of its kind of labour market effects, and I think everybody would agree with that. But do you think, it's probably the case that a lot of the degrees that are out there aren't necessarily necessary in order to do the job, and that they more act as kind of a filtering process among kind of applicants. Do you think that, and I'm not saying that we should have less, but just from a kind of academic debate, I guess, do you think that a lot of the qualifications that are out there aren't necessarily equipping people with the skills that are needed for them in the labour market?
Okay, just taking up on your opening comment, I wasn't necessarily saying that education isn't a guarantee of a job. What I was picking up was on some of the interesting stats, figures, what Eilish had drawn out, I just thought was interesting. And the fact that there have been evaluations done of supports like the Back to Education allowance and the employment bounce you would hope people would get through that second chance education is noticeable by its absence for many people overall, which is deeply concerning given the relationship between employment status and educational status. So and that's something that we need to get a handle on. Why? Because very often education and further educational attainment is put forward as a solution. So there's something missing there, and we need to get behind what's missing. Is it stigma in the labour market that if you have been and just one of the interesting figures that the CSO in their equality studies highlight, because they capture employment status, that one of the highest reasons for discrimination accessing a job is having been unemployed. So is it the fact that the person was unemployed and the fact that they've reskilled then isn't valued by a potential employer? Is it that, just picking up on your last question, that as far as the employer is concerned, they've done the wrong degree? So again, these are things I just think we need to get a handle on. As a society, we do seem to have an obsession with formal education, and the lengths to which the state is now going to try and sell apprenticeships to use the well-worn phrase, the mammies of Ireland, because of just that whole way education is valued in our culture. And we seem to assume that further educational attainment is the be-all and end-all, and it isn't necessarily. And also a big issue that I have is that sometimes our educational system isn't doing the very basic thing of teaching us all to think, to be critical, to engage as well as citizens. It is very much a plug in and feedback out again system. So again, they are some big cultural questions that we need to address. In the meantime, there are people who are unemployed, who are long-term unemployed, who are looking at the world around them, who are trying to figure out, how come I am getting a job? And then there are people who have gone back to education, feel I've done that and I'm still can't get a job. So I think we need an employment service that really works with people to secure employment, that opens the doors to the labour market, that advises people, and really gives them those good supports. And also then we need it working alongside the educational system, so people are getting good guidance around the educational courses. So if people decide to do it for education as an end in itself, at least they are knowing they're making that as a conscious choice, rather than maybe doing something thinking this will help me get a job, and in fact it proves not to do so. So I think again, just some of those more honest conversations in the supports and services that we offer people, I think would be helpful, so that we are supporting people to make informed choices, and people know kind of from where because particularly when people get older, you really then, if you are reskilling and you're engaging in education training to reskill, to improve your employment prospects, people really need to know that they're making the wisest choice, because as you get older, you've less time to be making the wrong trips down the road on that journey. So we just need to get that right, and we need the systems working better together so that they really are supporting the person and the person's prospects are improved.
Yeah, it's definitely easier to find a job when you have a job already. Before I open it up to everyone else, I'll just ask Anthony one question. And forgive me for zooming in on this comment that you made. I know it wasn't the core part of your presentation, but you said that the benefits system can get people stuck into a rut. I mean, any welfare system that you design is going to have some sort of anomalies, I guess. But obviously, you look at it overall, it lifts people out of poverty. And I wonder, does the British system suffer from one of the similar problems of the Irish system in that childcare costs are so expensive in the UK as they are in Ireland, and therefore when you have transfers but without publicly provided childcare, that this contributes to some of the traps, shall we say, such as they are, and I don't know how prevalent they are. So it's not necessarily that you have decent transfers, but it's transfers in conjunction with very expensive childcare in the UK. Because I do know the UK, along with Ireland, have among the most expensive childcare in the European Union.
Yes, no, thanks, Rob. In answer, yes, I mean, the new benefit system we introduced here a few years ago that's being rolled out was designed really to take that into consideration, because we had generations, 88% of the people who come through my program come from worklessness households where not a single person does work. And a lot of the reason for that is our benefit system and childcare, single parents, and people can really get into a rut, basically because they get trapped in this kind of this perpetual circle of the benefits and rents and council tax payments and all this type of stuff being paid. So they have no real willingness to go out. And if they do go out, they can either be at a loss or at a very, very, they could be up like 20 or 30 pound a week. And some people say, what's that all about? And trying to get somebody out of that, I mean, that is a real challenge for us. And I think there's been moves in this country to try and change that balance. But I still think for a lot of people, culturally, that is a big thing. And I think, Breed, what you're saying is really, the issue really is that in this country, we've got a highly educated group of people at our universities. They all come out with degrees. In actual fact, I often thought with Ireland, a lot of people get educated and they come straight over here. I think Ireland, brings a lot of people up, educates them for export because of opportunities. And outside your three major cities of 3 or 4, Cork and Limerick, Galway and Dublin, I mean, in all honesty, in the country areas, there isn't great opportunities for somebody who comes out. But I do agree, Ireland, a land of scholars, education is really up there for a lot of middle class families. But when you look at our bigger states, it's the opposite way around. And educational attainment sometimes is not fantastic. And what you're saying, Bridie, is really good. I think in our system, we have to have a system where we look at both. And the benefit system is a trap. I mean, you could really get hooked into it, and it can be very, very difficult to break out of it. Sorry, Rob, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry, Breed, do you have any comments on that?
Sorry, you're muted as well, Breed.
No, I've nothing to add to that. No, that was, yeah.
Okay. So unless any of the panelists have any questions that they want to ask of anyone else, I'll get to some of the audience questions. But so does anyone have anything that they want to ask? Okay, so there's a question here from Brian McLaughlin, and he says, how much additional expenditure is needed to fund measures to deal with long-term, he says long-term employment, but I guess he also means long-term unemployment, and how should it be funded? So how much money do we need to spend, and where should we spend it? So Does anybody want to take up that question? I mean, it's partly been dealt with a little bit. I think Tricia touched on it, and Bree did as well. So maybe I'll pose that to Eilish.
Thanks, Rob. I suppose again, I know Anthony, I won't say not too fond of the stats, but you know what the stats are like, and I suppose they often do direct policy. But I suppose at the minute, unlike we'll say after the financial crisis or the global recession, we have not seen at the moment. We have not seen a big, massive increase in long-term unemployment. So I suppose that the question then you ask yourself is there an intervention needed at this moment in time? And it's possible maybe that all unemployed need to be addressed, not just necessarily the long-term unemployed. And I suppose the way the department presently does that in terms of job seekers is they have a statistical profiling model where when a person becomes unemployed, they identify what the person's risk is becoming long-term unemployed, and then they're categorized into different groups to determine the level of intervention that they get. So I think the key thing at this moment in time, which the department have started to do, is they've had to reopen up those services again, because obviously when COVID hit, when I say everything shut down, a large proportion of that part of the department did close down because they had to turn to address the pandemic and the impact that had on the numbers. So I think the first key thing that the department needs to do is ensure that service is fully up and running again. And I know, like Trish and Bridget meant, it's not saying that's a perfect system, but that's the system we have in place at the moment. And then secondly, I think in terms of trying to prevent those who are in receipt of the payment going into long-term unemployment, I think the approach that the department have adopted in terms of reaching out to those who have been longest on the payment is a good approach, in the sense that, again, I suppose it is a measure maybe to try and minimise the number that are going to go into long-term unemployment. So I think, just to answer the question, I think at the moment it's not necessarily that additional money needs to go into the funding of long-term unemployment or addressing the issue. I think first the department, which they are doing, is trying to get their existing services up and running again, to address those who are on the PUP payment, specifically those who are at risk of becoming long-term unemployed because of the length that they're on that payment, or because of the particular sectors that they're in, or the age profile of the individual. And then I suppose observe what happens over the next few months to see if additional spending is needed in that area.
Okay. Yeah, and part of it is wait and see, because there is going to be a kind of natural stimulus to the economy, shall we say, when people spend some of the savings that they have accumulated.
Yeah, and just I suppose just on that, Rob, when you mentioned, like, I mean, the growth forecast, I suppose that's one of the interesting things about COVID. It is having a dual effect on economic growth. So obviously we know that a lot of some of the sectors like the hospitality or retail have badly affected, but there's been but the other sectors are doing very well, like the pharmaceuticals, your IT sectors, and we have quite positive growth forecasts for the next couple of years. So it is, I suppose, again, what the government is trying to do, bearing in mind that we're still in a situation where we have a virus or new variants emerging, but we're trying to get those elements of the economy open again. So I suppose maybe people who have discretionary income can potentially spend it in those areas, and those sectors that have been most affected can be reopened.
So we have a question from Nuala Whelan. It's posed to all panelists, I guess. And she says at Maynooth, they've developed a model of enabling employment guidance for long-term unemployed in employment services by guidance practitioners to support people identifying skills and work interests, translating qualifications into career plans, building self-esteem, and so on. And she says that unfortunately the activation-oriented approach does not allow for this model to be implemented. Have the panel any comments on how services could be implemented as increased focus on pay-by-results models does not value this type of service outcome? So I guess the question is that we have a model which you need to activate people, and it's not necessarily identifying the type of work that people want to do. And so do people kind of agree with that kind of analysis by Nuala, and what can be done about it to kind of reconcile people's interests and skills with the type of employment that they might actually take up? So perhaps Breed or Tricia might take that up.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't think it's just an issue for the payment by results model that the department has and it has used in some of it, how it's contracted out services and is proposing to use in the rollout of the regional employment service. I think it's also an issue for how the department does its own work through Intro, which is the service that the biggest number of people go through, because when you look at the live register, more people are on it short term than longer term. So I think this is an issue that needs to be addressed. We need guidance across the system. It needs to be an integral part of how Intro does its own work. And then it needs to be an integral part of how services are delivered by others. We're constantly told the world of work is changing and that the speed of change is going to increase. So we need employment services that can really work with people and guide people in a world that's where change is happening. Because if we don't do that, then there will be a cohort who will be left behind. And so we really need to get that piece right. So we really do need to have guidance as an integral part of the public employment service.
Okay, thank you, Breed. And we've just one more question from the audience. It's from Joe Saunders. And he mentions that the panel has highlighted the limitations of official definitions and have emphasized subjective measures, potential labor supply, in-work poverty, and education first approaches as significant issues. So what are the panel members' views on how these issues are impacted by proposed changes to local employment services, particularly those who don't qualify, particularly those who don't claim qualifying payments? So the fact that you aren't necessarily classified as unemployed doesn't necessarily mean that your access to the labor market is fine. And we did discuss that already. Tricia, did you have a view on how these issues kind of interact with the welfare service?
Yeah, no, I think it's an important point that the employment services should be available to all who need it, based as a pure activation measure. For example, a lot of people, women in particular, who are qualified adults, may not be able to access services if it's based on claimants and qualifying payments as well. So you could have a very particular gendered impact in terms of a move towards that particular model. But just going back to the previous question as well, what's so important is the integration of services and support services for people who are trying to access work. And I think the NESC report from a couple of years ago really highlighted kind of the fragmented nature of support services for people, and having a wraparound service that is person-centered, understanding the needs for people as well. Because just going back to the point around the link between education and work, you know, for a lot of lone parents, they do have good educational qualifications, but there's no childcare, and that's kind of not factored in then to how they are dealt with in terms of employment supports as well. So it's really, really important that it is very much an integrated approach in terms of the types of supports people need, not just those in terms of employment supports. And again, that it's very person-centered. And I think just in terms of the service response, in terms of the ratio of caseworkers to persons who are seeking services is very, very high, and we need to look at ensuring that the intro services is focused on a case-by-case basis and being able to deliver that kind of integrated and person-centered approach as well.
Okay, we have one more question actually, which we have time to get to, and it's from Brendan McLaughlin, I think it is. I can't see the full name, but it's about rural communities and the future of youth working and living in rural communities. I mean, Anthony actually touched on some of that issues as well, that if you have that a lot of Irish people, they get their qualifications and then they go to the UK afterwards. Now, there are opportunities in, say, Dublin and Cork if you are educated, but a lot of, say, especially more rural communities, that they don't provide opportunities for educated people. I mean, I guess it's an issue with any rural or small population centre, in that the diversity of employment isn't going to be as large. But anyway, the question is, so we need to deliver a more holistic portfolio of opportunities for youth to engage with those activities which deliver more positive outcomes for our undeserved young cohorts in our communities who want to stay, live, learn, and work in our rural communities. In our case, Tipperary is said to be a desert of youth engagement opportunities. In South Tipperary, the local community is proposing the creation of a technical network. So because Anthony, I know this is an Irish question, so what are the practical and frugal activities would the panel suggest we focus our priority efforts on? Now, I know this is more of an Irish question, but because Anthony has mentioned the fact that he's from Tipperary, or his family's from Tipperary, perhaps he could answer, well, what does the UK do in order to provide opportunities for people from rural communities? Now, the geography and demographics of the UK are very different. There's a lot more population centres in the UK. There's a lot more second-tier cities in the UK, but perhaps Anthony could make some comments on how the UK provides opportunities for people coming from rural communities.
Yeah, thanks for that, Rob. I would probably, I mean, connectivity is really important. And the one thing that I've noticed on my trips to Ireland, you know, if you're not in a big town or a city, if you're in the rural areas, travel, connectivity to different areas to travel to work is a big challenge. And I still think that remains a big challenge. While Ireland has put a lot of money into infrastructure in the last few years, when I've been over and seen bits and pieces, it still could go further. I think the other thing that the Irish government really does need to take an account of, and I'm not too sure if some people in Dublin do join up the dots, but what I do find, there is a real disconnect in the skills audit and industries that remain in Ireland. I mean, Ireland does have some incredible industries, real high-tech industries that are located, you know, around Dublin and Galway and Limerick and Cork. But still within these other areas, you get people that are coming out of the educational system really educated, and they've either got to relocate to another part of where that's going, or they come over here. And I think when the Irish government is looking at these rural towns and communities, they need to really, in the assessment of what comes out of the schools and colleges, they need to really look at up and coming people that are coming out and what do they need to plan. And some of that strategic thinking, it's not 5 or 10 years, it's 20 years. You know, it could be 30 years down the road of where the country needs to be. I mean, in this country at the moment, connectivity is good, but if you look at, say, Manchester, so Greater Manchester has a population of 3 million. Well, after the Second World War, Manchester basically diversified into a number of key industries. And the reason why I'm saying this is that I'll give you another example of a city in this country that didn't. So Manchester, for instance, outside the city of London, there's more banks in Manchester and everything. So it's a major centre for banking. It's a major centre for transport. The roads in and out are really, really good. Media City and TV is massive up here. So there is a number of industries that support, and I live in the Peak District, so I live in a very rural area. I live 22 miles out the centre of Manchester, but I do get a local train in every morning into Piccadilly, and then I come up to where I am. Just my partner and I decided we wanted a little bit more. As you get old and bald and fat, you kind of move out to the country then, don't you, as you're getting a bit older. So I kind of moved out a few years ago, but that's my choice. But in Greater Manchester, where you're looking at here, the south and the west of the city, the Cheshire, the Derbyshire side of Greater Manchester is the wealthiest. I'm not saying I'm healthy, but it's the wealthiest. And people do commute here, like in London, people commute here. So I do think the first thing is connectivity. I think the second thing is the skills audit. You know, the Irish government really do need to understand where people are coming up from and where their skills are. And I think also apprenticeships. You know, for many years here, we ditched them. We went straight down the academic route. You know, when Tony Blair was Prime Minister, you know, it was all, everyone has to go to university and come out with a degree. Well, we had people graduating in this country with a degree that wasn't really worth the paper it was printed on. It was absolutely a load of tosh, and people couldn't get a job. And sometimes children or young people leaving school, going in to a firm where they get an apprenticeship and a day release to college, sometimes is a far better route for a lot of people. And the research that I've done over the years, I mean, you could split our country, this country here, down the middle, you know, with 50% coming from an academic background and 50% really coming from more a tangible, hands-on approach in industry. And I think when I look at the issues that affect people, there's a lot of them, but I definitely think the big thing for Ireland is its connectivity, and the Irish government need to get a handle on that.
Yeah, we do have a very car-dependent society in Ireland, and also in Ireland, we have a lot of scattered development. So in the 2000s in particular, we built a lot of houses. Well, not just, actually, it got slightly better in the 2000s, but historically, we've built a lot of one-off rural housing. So we have a lot of dispersed settlement in Ireland, which isn't conducive to connectivity, apart from it being you know, bad for the environment and not very efficient from an economic perspective. I was going to use that as a segue because I'm actually doing some work on housing at the moment and the planning and land, but I was going to use that as a segue to wrap it up into you know, wrap up this meeting and talk about some of the things TASC are doing. But Eilish just wants to come back there briefly. You're on mute, Eilish.
Oh, thanks, Rob. I know I was just saying that the scheme that's been created in Tipperary that Brandon mentioned, it's very interesting because I'm sure some of the other panels will have experienced the same when you've been working in this area. Like, one of the issues for young people in terms of getting employment is that experience. It's getting the foot in the door. So I think the more that can be done to try and, I suppose, open employers to give opportunities to young people in that regard, it's very important, because I said it's often one of the blocks that prevents young people from actually getting a job or getting a more sustainable job, whether they're going from secondary or whether they're going from third level, is that they often don't have that link, or they're missing the experience component. Now, I suppose at third level, some of the universities, particularly the University of Limerick, a lot of their degree programs will give students the opportunity to get that link through the final year of the program. But even if you come back from the university setting, as I said, if there's programs being set up in communities for younger people who might not necessarily go on to third level, as I said, getting that link, providing them with opportunities to get experience in the workplace is a key component to try and get them into sustainable, I suppose, employment longer term.
Yeah, important to get your foot in the door. Okay, so first of all, I'd like to thank the panelists for joining us, Anthony, Breed, Tricia, and Eilish. Thank you for your time, and I hope you thought it was an interesting conversation. And I'd also like to thank the audience for joining us today. Some of you might be aware that TASC has been hosting, as a lot of organizations have, a lot of online events recently. We have been doing work called Conversations with Leaders. So over the last few months, we've had events where we've essentially had a conversation with the leaders of the main political parties in Ireland, actually almost all of the political parties in Ireland. And we've basically gotten around to everybody. But in September, we will continue our kind of series, but in a slightly different format of conversations with leaders. And we'll be talking with some of business leaders and what their views are on what Ireland needs to do. It's interesting that organizations like IBEC, for instance, are calling for increased investment in the economy, and that we can't just rely on FDI as a model of economic growth, and we need to grow our industry. So I think our first conversation in September will be with Colin Hunt of AIB. But also into the autumn, and this year TASC is celebrating its 20th anniversary. TASC has been on the Irish scene for 2 decades now, advocating and researching and informing the public on issues surrounding democracy and inequality, although we've branched out now into climate change, broader social exclusion issues as well. So we will be hosting a series of events in the autumn to acknowledge our 20th anniversary. So thank you very much, everybody, for your participation, and good afternoon.